I unironically like Driver 3. I know that it's awful, I just sort of love it. Whatever you think about it, it's undeniable that Driver 3 was at least an ambitious game. So ambitious in fact that they ran out of money trying to finish it, so what was released was an unfinished game that was met with negative reviews and a journalism scandal. With that in mind, it's sort of weird and surprising that almost a year and a half after the initial console release, a Game Boy Advance version snuck its way onto store shelves. It's October of 2005, Driver 3 on the GBA just came out, the PSP has been out for a few months in the West, and the DS has been out for almost a year, so it's not surprising that this Game Boy Advance game didn't make much of a splash, but just look at it. These 3D graphics are incredible. With two massive free roam cities with what the back of the box claims to be over 30 miles of road each, and gameplay which seamlessly switches between driving and third-person shooting, Driver 3 on the GBA, like its console counterpart, is also a super ambitious game. It's not a controversial statement to say that this might be the most ambitious game on the system. It's developed by the French studio VD Dev, known at the time as Velez and GBA Dev, who have been known for pushing graphical boundaries on Nintendo handhelds since the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Founded in 1990, games like V-Rally, Wacky Races, Supercross Freestyle, and some others put them on the map as developers who pushed the limits, but it was their GBA efforts that really made them stand out. We've looked at all these games on the channel before, but for a quick recap, they started out with V-Rally 3 in 2002, which served as the introduction of the engine that would be used for all their GBA titles. The amount of tricks and workarounds this engine must use is unthinkable considering how good this looks and how smooth the frame rate is. The engine is characterized by it bizarrely warping around the edges of the screen near the camera. It's more noticeable in the other games, and from what I assume, it's a side effect of the way the engine uses the player's perspective to rotate and display its graphics. V-Rally 3 was followed up a year later by Stuntman in 2003, which interestingly is a conversion of a PS2 game that was developed by Reflections, the same developers behind the main version of Driver 3. Another year passes and Asterix and Obelix XXL comes out in 2004, which is a 3D platformer instead of a driving game, and it looks absolutely stunning. Like with some small touch-ups, this wouldn't look out of place on a PlayStation. Then finally, the next year, Driver 3 was released, which feels like VD Dev took what they learned so far on the GBA and put it all together. Another thing that's worth noting is that in 2002, Atari also released a version of Driver 2 on the GBA. This ran on a different engine and was developed by a different company, Sonari Interactive, and naturally it does some things similar to Driver 3. Growing up, I had Driver 2 on the GBA, and it was a cool game which also featured an impressive 3D engine and both driving and on-foot mechanics, but because its development was so detached from that of Driver 3 on the GBA, I won't be referring to it in this video. Maybe it's a topic for another video. So like with their previous GBA titles, Velez and GBA have taken the main Driver 3 game and compromised and compressed it down, using the same basic structure and assets. Many world textures are ripped from the main game, character and car sprites have been formed out of 3D models, slideshows have been made out of the pre-rendered cutscenes, and even some sound effects like the car sounds have been reused here. It's on record that they wanted to make this game as close to the console version as possible. Because of this, the game looks remarkably similar to the main game, and if you know Driver 3 well, you've probably already recognized a lot of this. It visually captures the feel of Miami and Nice really well. Here's a side-by-side of Miami's maps, with the GBA one on the left. Please excuse the markings all over these, I could only find maps that were guides for one thing or another. On the right are images from the Driver 3 wiki, and on the left they're from Neo Seeker by a guy named PSX Driver Player. I love you, buddy. Also, I love that you seem to have made these just last year. Looking at it, you can see they're remarkably similar. There have been some changes, like some minor streets have been removed and some parts have been slightly rearranged, but for the most part this is the same map. Here's a side-by-side driving up Miami Beach. You can see that on the GBA it's much more of an approximation, like it's much smaller but it's still recognizable-ish. Further up north, here's where the beach ends and transitions onto the road. Again, handled differently, but it's similar. Then the road layout being virtually the same, you have this small bridge followed by these open parks on the left, and further along is the bridges through the Venetian Islands. Thanks Google for teaching me so much about Miami. Moving west, I love sounding like a weatherman, here's the front of the American Airlines Arena. You can see they've made the effort to put in the stairs on the GBA, though they're not as extravagant. I also love looking at this stuff in real life for comparison, so here it is on Google Street View. Hey look, Paul McCartney's playing. Dodge Island looks fairly different in both versions, but it's still Dodge Island, and you're noticing a pattern here. Everything is scaled down for the GBA, but it's all still here. Let's look at Nice. Again, the maps are very similar. The GBA one isn't quite as long and it's not as detailed in some spots, like on the left here with this circular thing and up on the hills here on the right. I think that Nice being more mountainous and varied makes for a much more interesting video game level. Here's the airport. The GBA version has a nice fully modelled plane in it and you can still drive off the edge into the water in both games, except you explode on the GBA. On the other side of the beach is Mont Boron. Here's that place you can spawn in the main game with the little tunnel in it. Here's that windy road down to the left. Notice the main game has some shortcuts in it that have been omitted on the GBA. Then there's the road down to the beach as we go around the aptly named Le Port. Here's the road that runs along the beach. Like all of this, it's not very similar, but it is recognizable. Then of course, this is the beach itself. I'm not sure why the Game Boy version seems to have a beach made of gravel, but it is what it is. That concludes our geography lesson for today, kids. Here's a dope crash I did on the beach. Isn't this just the most Driver 3 thing you've ever seen? Now the main version of Driver 3 had another city in it. Istanbul has been removed entirely here, presumably because of size or development time constraints, so the story has been restructured into just the two cities, with most of the beats taking place earlier than they should. So cutscenes from the main game that should be in Istanbul are repurposed for Nice, or Nice cutscenes are in Miami, so the game still tells the same basic story. Interestingly, the story mode is the only mode in this where the driving missions from the original game have been implemented as side missions, and there's no separate take-a-ride mode. A lot of the missions from the main game are here in one form or another. You still chase down Bacchus and shoot him down in an alley, you still sit in the back of Khalid's van to shoot down pursuers, you still escape from Gator on Dodge Island, and you still blow up his yacht. However, there are also a lot of missions which just don't or barely try to replicate missions, and these are usually much worse. Like, a lot of them are just driving across the map on a strict time limit or collecting scattered objects. One mission has you do this in a boat, which was particularly disorientating and awful, especially thanks to some dodgy hit detection and an evil time limit. Once you strip down all the impressive tech here, and that's not to discount how impressive it really is, lying underneath is a super frustrating and unenjoyable game. Driving around doesn't really feel right, the cars sort of float weirdly when you turn and they bounce off everything in an unnatural way, which is especially annoying thanks to the awful collision detection. Cars can't get air or take damage, and there's no AI in this game, so the missions are heavily scripted and you're never actually getting chased, which is sort of what the Driver series is all about. It's especially weird in the open world because you can't get chased by the cops, they just sort of ignore everything you do, so getting around between missions is fairly boring and inconsequential since the only way to die is by driving a car into the water. The closest thing we get to AI is the on-foot enemies, but to call these guys AI would be a disgrace to AI. If I could see the code for this, I'd imagine they'd have 3 functions. Walk in a random direction, shoot at the player or companion, and stand still. Every half a second or so, choose any function at random. Couple these erratic enemies with some bad controls and again some bad hit detection, and you have some of the worst third-person shooting gameplay I've ever seen. But it gets worse. Ammo is seriously limited, and it doesn't reset before or after missions. I went into multiple missions simply not having enough ammo to beat them. Even if I hit every shot, which is virtually impossible because of the hit detection, I still wouldn't have enough bullets to beat the mission. So what you have to do is search random alleyways and corners of the map for singular clips of ammunition until you have enough to reattempt the mission. This can take upwards of 10 minutes because they're fairly uncommon, and remember, ignoring the visuals, getting around in these cities is actually really boring. It's also an immensely difficult game. Like, there are 2 full playthroughs of this on YouTube, both of which are emulated, and one dude concedes that he used slowdown, save states, and frame advances to get through the game, and he thinks that the other guy cheated too. Personally, I only use save states, but I didn't actually finish the game. I got really close, but I just got so frustrated with the monotony and the precision this game required from me, so I was happy to just watch the ending online. If I didn't have any save states, I definitely wouldn't have got past Miami. Like, this game punishes you so heavily, you can be set back a good 5 minutes when you die. I'm confident that most people who bought this game and played it on real hardware haven't even seen Nice, which is a shame because it's more interesting and impressive than Miami, and there's no normal cheat codes to get there. Stepping back, as awful as this game can be, there's no denying that it's also an incredible game. Like, knowing what the GBA can do, what it's capable of, you know, what the specs are, this version of Driver 3 is simply amazing. It's just such an unusual and interesting achievement, and apparently due to restructuring and mismanagement at Atari at the time, it had a very troubled development period, and Velez and GBA themselves aren't happy with the final product, so just imagine what it could have been. VD Dev would go on to develop 2 more games, Cop the Recruit, which is basically an attempt at a driver game on the DS, and Ironfall Invasion, which I haven't played, but it looks like a Gears of War style cover shooter. Currently they're working on a game called Rise Race of the Future, but tragically in June of 2016, co-founder Fernando Velez passed away and development has been uncertain since. My condolences go out to the programming geniuses at VD Dev. I hope it all works out in the future, and there's a great in-depth video by Stop Skeletons from Fighting about VD Dev, which you should check out if you'd like to know more about them. A link below is in the description. Whatever you do, thanks for watching. I really appreciate all the support for this hobby. Like, we're coming up on 20,000 subscribers soon, and to me that's just so surreal. Hopefully I can keep making stuff for you all to enjoy, and it's really been a fun ride so far. Have a good one.